Hello and welcome to Pints with Aquinas. My name is Matt Fradd, and today on the show I have Dr. Kyle Keltz to discuss the problem, or is it a problem, of animal suffering. Kyle Keltz is Assistant Professor of English and Philosophy at South Plains College, where he teaches philosophy, world religions, and English composition. He has articles published in the Heathrop Journal, the Journal of Value Inquiry, New Black Friars, Nova et Vetera, and Sophia. Kyle lives in Lubbock, Texas, with his wife and two sons. Great to have you with us, Kyle.
Good morning, Matt. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. Tell us how you got interested in this issue of animal suffering.
Oh, well, yeah, I got my PhD in philosophy of religion at Southern Evangelical Seminary, and it's a seminary that Protestant seminary that actually puts a lot of emphasis on the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. It was actually just one of the very first classes I took. They told us to start thinking about what our dissertation topic would be early on. I took a class on the problem of evil, and I read a book by Michael Murray called Nature Red and Tooth and Claw. And I don't know what it was. I read the book and I kind of got hooked into the problem. I thought it was so interesting how it deals with uh, so many things in the philosophy of religion, God's existence, the problem of evil, animal minds. And I just decided that that was going to be my dissertation topic. I liked what Murray had to say, but I thought that Thomas Aquinas's philosophy could provide an even more robust response. So that's how I got started. And I did my dissertation on it. And after I graduated, I had my dissertation published as a book called Thomism and the Problem of Animal Suffering.
And one of the things I find a little frustrating when I speak with fellow Christians is that we often seem unwilling to feel the weight of a certain argument against Christianity. Maybe we're all like that as humans. We don't like arguments that go against our position. A couple of days ago, I was speaking to a lady, I think I mentioned to you, behind the coffee counter, and she said, "Oh, we've answered that years ago," or something like that. And just this morning, I was having coffee with a friend. I have coffee a lot, apparently, and he said, he just sort of was a little dismissive of it. And I just thought, okay, let's try to feel the weight of it here. So maybe you could do that for us. Maybe articulate the argument against God's existence from animal suffering in a way that we can actually wrestle with it. Because this is what Aquinas did so well. He wouldn't strawman his opponent's positions. He would make them as robust as he could. So how would you do that?
Right. Okay. Yeah. And for those who don't know, the problem of animal suffering is a version of the problem of evil. The problem of evil, obviously, is when we deal with how can bad things be happening in the world. Although we as Christians say that it is created by an all-knowing, all-loving, all-good God, right? Well, when theists try to defend Christianity or theism against the problem of evil, they usually use some kind of answer to it, like God allows people to do bad things because he wants people to have free will. Or they'll mention soul making, like God wants to allow us to encounter evil things because it helps us to mature spiritually, or something like that. But most pretty much all of the classical answers to the problem of evil don't apply to animals. And this is something that it's a problem that's arisen in modern times. I've read that in Europe, like in the 1600s, is when more people started owning pets. But it's this time onwards when people start to getting more day-to-day experience with animals, start caring about them more, start thinking about them more. But when you think about it, the problem can be pretty bad from a certain perspective. Like, well, for one thing, when human beings mistreat each other or do bad things, that is primarily because of our free will.
Mm-hmm.
But when one animal eats another animal, or when an animal's just starving or suffering, there is no middleman. There's no human element in that. I mean, human beings can mistreat animals, but if they're, it was like we talked about previously. Um, I think a great example of it would be the 2020 wildfires in Australia.
Right.
I read an article that was published by the World Wildlife Fund they reported that it was more than 3 billion animals were either killed or displaced by those fires.
Let me
It, they,
put this image up here for people to see of the kangaroo that was found.
oh
Yeah, can you
yeah,
see that? Yeah, burnt alive, stuck
yeah,
in
that's a
those
pretty
fences.
vivid image, because as Christians, as theists, we're trying to say that the world is the product is, or there's an all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God who is sustaining everything in existence right now, and that kangaroo is a part of that. So it really, and when you think of the natural history of the earth, that's what these atheists are framing the problem. They're saying that, and God most likely does not exist because an all knowing, all powerful, all loving God wouldn't use millions and millions of years of animal suffering, disease, and death to form a world just for human beings to live on it.
Hmm.
And after we show up, there's still every day there's more animal death and disease and suffering and starvation. So that's the issue.
Okay. Yeah, gosh, there's so many places to go from here. Did you have something you wanted to say, or do you want me to ask some questions?
Oh well, yeah. So one of the reasons why I'm glad to be here this morning is because this issue has apparently been getting some coverage on YouTube,
Right.
right? We talked about Alex O'Connor,
Alex
the
O'Connor.
cosmic skeptic, did a video on it. I almost spit out my coffee when I saw the video, because I've been working on this for the past few years, and he was
Yeah.
saying that it's animal problem of animal suffering is Christianity's number one problem, and barely anyone is trying to answer it. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
you're like,
so
I am.
yeah, what? so, that's what I wanted to do, was kind of discuss the issue, kind of frame it a little bit in the way that he discussed it. I remember a couple things he said. Obviously, one of them was that it's Christianity's number one problem. But one of the things he said is, like, he could easily imagine God creating a world where animals don't suffer whatsoever. He admitted that animals weren't that aren't they're not rational, but he thought, yeah, God could have created a world without it. And he also mentioned something that I should probably mention later on, but he argues that animals obviously do suffer. So
Hmm.
what's up with that? And now, when he was talking about it, he would say it's Christianity's number one problem. And then other places, oh yeah, that was one thing he said, was the world we see today is exactly the world we should expect if there is no all loving, all knowing, all powerful God creating it and sustaining it because of all the animal suffering. So I wanted to answer that.
Mm.
Um, but when he's saying all this, in the philosophy of religion, when scholars debate the problem of evil, they usually go about it one of two ways. So an atheist will either say that Christianity and theism are internally incoherent. When you believe in an all loving, all powerful, all good God, and you believe in the existence of evil at the same time, it comes together to form a contradiction. Okay. That's called the logical problem of evil. Another way they go about it is more what's called the evidential problem of evil. And they say, well, there's so much evil in the world that God's existence is likely not possible.
Hmm.
And I wasn't exactly sure which way he was going about it, whether he was switching back and forth or not. But I wanted to provide an answer to both versions of it from animal
Hmm.
suffering. And that's how I wanted to frame it. But I was wanting to
Yeah, I
make
like that.
four main points that I make in my book. Okay. And the first 2 points are that pain and suffering are they're good things in a sense because they help us survive. They help animals survive. The second point I wanted to make is that I think that we are kind of overstepping our epistemic boundaries when we say that we know that it's a logical contradiction that an all loving, all good God would not allow suffering. Okay, so I wanted to talk about those first in the context of more of the logical problem, and then I wanted to move on and discuss well, I'm going to be discussing Aquinas' philosophy throughout this, but I want to discuss scientific findings on from comparative psychology, what
Mm.
scientists and researchers have found about the animal minds, because I think there's good evidence to show that animals aren't self-aware, and that means they're not persons, and their suffering is not morally relevant. But we can dig into that, and I'll show you why it. There's some neat things some distinctions we can make to show why that is. And then
All
the
right.
last thing I want to talk about is showing that I think that the universe we see is better explained if we think that a all good God exists than it is to think that there is no God and all of this is completely random.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds terrific.
All right, great. So yeah, the first. Okay, so I wanted to make these first 2 points. Is one is that pain is good, and two, uh, we can't really know that God ought not to allow animals to undergo suffering. The first point. Oh, and I just wanted to reemphasize that I'm going to be mainly giving a defense of theism. Okay, that's another distinction. Is there's philosophers of religion distinguish between what's called a defense of theism or a theodicy. And a defense is where you just say, well, at bottom, there's just not a logical contradiction. Okay,
Got you.
I
Yeah,
might not
yeah.
even be giving a reason for why the evil exists, but the existence of this certain type of evil and God aren't contradictory.
Right.
Okay.
In other words, you're essentially saying maybe God doesn't exist, but your argument doesn't show that.
Yes, yes, yes. I'm just trying to show at bottom there is no. It's not necessarily logically contradictory
Got you.
to say that there's some type of evil and God existing at the same time, right? So my first point that I like to point out, and this was something I found interesting when I entered, when I entered this debate and I start studying all this, I noticed that both the atheists and the theists were just assuming that pain is a intrinsically bad thing. It's a natural evil. It shouldn't exist, basically. And I found this interesting, especially because when I'm studying Aquinas, I see that he followed Augustine, and he has this privation view of evil, right? That evil is a privation of some good. Um, Aquinas and the other medievals, scholastics, believed that um, being and good are just two different ways of looking at the same thing. It is obviously a good to exist rather than not to exist, right? But also when in our everyday language, when I say when I say this coffee is good, what I mean by that is that it exists in a way that's pleasing to me. I don't know. Coffee is a little subjective, but say that I say this is a good computer, or oh, there's a computer in front of me, and I say this is a good computer. I mean that it exists in the way that a computer ought to exist, and it does all
Yeah.
the functions properly, right? If I'm missing half of my keys and it won't turn on, then it's a bad computer because it's missing things it ought to have. So whenever you start thinking about pain and suffering, pain actually can't be an evil according to the privation view
Mm.
of evil, because it has an ontological status. Like it's partly caused by our nervous system, right?
Mm.
So it's not like something that is in animals that ought not to be there. And
Mm.
of course, when you look at the scientific research, that scientists know that if animals weren't able to feel pain at all, they wouldn't make it very long in this world. They would die
Right.
a very early death.
So pain isn't an evil necessarily. I mean, it might be inflicted through a moral evil or something like that. But if one didn't feel pain, if one lacked the capacity for pain, that would be a physical evil for a person because he ought to
Yes,
feel it.
yes, it would actually be an evil for you not to be able
Or a
to feel
human
pain.
person, I should say. Not a person, because I guess angels wouldn't feel pain. But yes, continue.
Right, right. And they wouldn't need to feel pain because they don't have physical bodies.
Right.
Um, Now, yeah, and one thing I wanted to mention here is there's a professional philosopher. His name is William Rowe, and he has kind of a famous formulation of a problem of evil that involves animal suffering. And he brought up a concept known as gratuitous evil.
Mm-hmm.
His argument was, and it's when we talk about Roe, we usually talk about evidential arguments. But within his argument was a logical problem for theism. And he said that an all good, all knowing, all loving God would not allow evil unless he had some unless allowing that evil would bring about a greater good or prevent an equal evil or a worse evil. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And he uses in the philosophy of religion, it's kind of a famous example. He uses a fawn, and it's really fitting, especially with the wildfires in 2020 in Australia. But he uses a fawn getting caught in a forest fire, an example. And he says, let's say that a fawn gets trapped in a forest fire, a tree falls on it, it gets badly burned, but it doesn't die right away. It suffers and starves over the course of 3 or 4 days. And he thought that that would be a case of what would be called gratuitous evil, pointless suffering. Because when he looks at an instance like that and thinks about it, he's just like, I just can't imagine any good coming from that, or some equal evil being prevented, or some worse evil being prevented from that. So he thinks it's pointless. And that's one of the logical problems I'm trying to answer in my book. So if we're saying that it's contradictory to believe that God and animal suffering coexist, one thing I wanted to point out was, if animals weren't able to feel pain, they wouldn't even, like that fawn wouldn't have even lived long enough to get caught in that forest fire. Mm-hmm. And I brought this up to you, and I try not to talk about people too much because it gets us confused. We're just talking about the problem of animal suffering, and we're not talking about human beings. But yeah, that's something I like to bring up, is that there is a condition called congenital insensitivity to pain, and it's a very rare condition that some babies are born with, and they can't feel pain at all. Excuse me. I've heard that they can. Excuse me, Matt.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, because my first thought with the deer is, your response to the man who said this is clearly gratuitous is, maybe if the tree had fallen on him and he had died, that wouldn't necessarily be gratuitous, although I'm not sure how you would know that. But you said,
Right.
Well, if he didn't feel pain, he wouldn't have lived long enough for the tree to fall on him. But maybe a lot of suffering that led to him getting hit by the tree was also gratuitous. I see what you mean. We're going to get to this about the epistemic bounds. It's kind of difficult. It's difficult.
Yes.
How do you know there's no good? Although it does seem on the face of it there is no good for an animal to lay there for a day or two starving to death. But
right. Yeah, and what I was going to say is, like, if you can Google this right now. There's a girl named Ashlyn Blocker. She was born with that disorder I was talking about.
right.
These babies can't feel pain. I've heard that they can feel the difference between hot and cold, but they can't feel it if their body is being damaged. Mm-hmm. If you Google, they put a story about her, and they took a picture of her, and she's still alive miraculously. The thing is, with these babies that are born this way, most of them don't make it to the age of 4, and a lot of them die as toddlers. Mm-hmm. And if you see, they took a picture of her when she was 2 years old. Her fingers are bandaged because she would chew them, and she didn't realize it was hurting her. And I've also read that they have to bandage their fingers so they don't scratch their eyes out. But they can bite their tongues. They can burn themselves. They don't make it long. And when we think about if animals weren't able to feel pain, it would be the same thing. One thing that I want to argue is that there isn't any moment in the fawn's suffering when it's burned and afterwards that the pain is not serving a function. I mean, for one, we want to talk about a greater good coming from the animal suffering. The fact that it had the ability to feel pain throughout its entire life kept it alive just to get to the forest fire. Does that make sense? Like, if we want to talk about a greater good coming from it, that animal would have died as a toddler, as a very young animal. If it didn't have the ability to feel pain, it wouldn't have made it that long. So I feel like we're ignoring that in this whole thing. We're getting to that moment of pain and saying, well, what could come out of that? But something has already come from its ability to feel pain.
Okay, but wouldn't the argument be, or wouldn't the response be, sure, pain serves a function, but not the type of pain it experienced right before it died? That pain, that suffering, was futile because that led to nothing. You're kind of getting it
Right.
backwards. So like pain can
Yes.
help it to survive, but the type of pain, that seems futile at the end.
Yes. And that's an objection that I talked about in my book. So I want to answer that objection, and then I hope I don't forget. If I do, remind me. But I also want to go further and talk about something David Hume brought up.
Okay.
Now, we could imagine, and I thought about this. So if we want to say, okay, well, that's great that it had the ability to feel pain through its whole life. It kept it alive. But now, whenever the pain and suffering doesn't serve a purpose,
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't it just like shut off? And yeah, maybe it won't die immediately, but it at least won't suffer for those last 3 or 4 days. And this is the point where, and it's kind of like what you were getting at. How is this going to work? So we're talking about it needs some kill switch that's going to shut off its ability to feel pain after a certain point. And I was just imagining it. So, okay, so what would have triggered the kill switch in the situation? Would it be the tree falling on it? So we're talking about if a fawn bumps into something really hard, or there's a big impact near it, it's going to stop being able to feel pain. Or I mean, and let because like, well, what if it had something like that, and then it bumps into another fawn, and then both fawns quit feeling pain, and then they both die because they can't feel pain? How does it know that it needs to shut back on? I
Yes.
mean, uh, and another thing is like, what if it does have a kill switch system, and then it starts to get old, and maybe it malfunctions, and it dies an early death? It could have lived 5 or 10 more years, but it started to get old, and it started having problems with that. When I look at it, I mean, I can say, yeah, I can imagine some amazing kill switch system that's built into an animal, but I honestly don't know how that's going to work. And
Mm.
I'm not saying that because I can't imagine it working, it's not logically possible. I'm just saying that I think it's kind of presumptuous to say that we think that something like that could work. Because whenever I
Mm.
look at the ability to feel pain, it looks like something, like engineers have to make design trade-offs whenever they design systems. Sometimes you have to leave something in, even though it's not the most optimal. In certain situations, it's just the best option you have to go with. And for all we know, what I
Yeah.
would like to say is, for all we know, there's just that kind of system isn't possible. Um,
Interesting.
and the other day when we were talking, you were like, well, yeah, of course, pain is a good thing. It keeps us alive. But atheists wouldn't say that pain is something that, they wouldn't stump their toe and say, well, God doesn't exist. That's terrible.
Right.
But
Yeah, I don't know many atheists who
actually,
would say that.
right. Well, David Hume,
Oh.
in his dialogues concerning natural religion, had a character, Philo, who in the dialogue, he argues that, well, why couldn't, like, he thinks the existence of pain shows that God doesn't exist, because an all-loving God would more likely make it so that we feel pleasure all the time as like
Right.
a neutral state, and if you get hurt, you just feel less pleasure.
This reminds me of one of Dr. Craig's. That's interesting. Dr. Craig's sort of response to this. He says we have this kind of Disneyfied view of God, right? And that it's God's
Right.
job to create a comfortable little habitat for his human pets. Like that's his job. And
Yes.
so if
A
I'm
divine
not
pet owner.
comfortable, yes, if I'm not comfortable, then it shows that the divine pet owner doesn't work. Well, what if God isn't a divine pet owner, you know?
Right. Right. And in answer to this, okay, now first of all, I think that if you felt pleasure all the time, I think that would minimize
I wouldn't do
greater
anything.
amounts of pleasure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we,
right.
we
Like,
don't. And that's what Netflix has provided. We're useless now. We're useless as an ashtray on a motorbike because we have infinite amounts of entertainment at our disposal. Yeah.
oh, yeah. Um, well, and that's the thing, is pleasure moves us to do certain things in life. As part animal, pleasure
Yeah,
is what motivates us to have
that's right.
sex. It's what motivates us to eat sometimes, and
Mm-hmm.
other things. And for one, I think that would make that. I don't think we would do those things as much. But as far as pain and suffering goes, I mentioned this to you last time. There was a doctor named Paul Brand who did research in India, in the 1940s and 60s. They were working with Hansen's disease patients, which is leprosy. And if you know anything about that, I don't know much, but I know that I'm not an expert in it, but I know that it can affect your hands and your feet. Some of them lose all mobility in it, but it affects your nerves. And an issue that they were Paul Brand and his associates were trying to get these Hansen's disease patients back to living a normal life, and they had decreased sensitivity in their extremities, and one of those things was the inability to feel pain. And a problem was when they would start working, they would hurt themselves while they were working. So Dr. Brand and his associates were trying to figure out how to help them do that, work without hurting themselves. And one thing they tried in the beginning was to just they set up a system so if they put too much pressure on an extremity, it would make a light go off. But that didn't really stop them. They just wanted to get the work done, and the light would go off, but it really didn't affect their behavior. So eventually they found that the only thing that worked at all was they set up a system that instead of just having a light go off, it would shock the patient to get them to quit doing what they were doing. It was hurting them. But even then they found when they observed them that they would just they would receive the shock, realize they were putting too much pressure on whatever task they're performing. Then they would just turn the machine off, do the work, and turn it back on. What they realized was that the unpleasantness of pain is necessary to get us to avoid something that's going to hurt us. Without the ability to feel pain and for it to be a negative sensation, we become task oriented and not self oriented. We're more concerned about performing tasks in the world than we are about preserving our bodies. Okay. So I just think that's scientific evidence that shows that if pain wasn't unpleasant, animals most likely it just wouldn't it wouldn't deter them from getting hurt. So
I also want to ask the atheist what he's after. If he says, well, there's all this animal suffering and that provides a good argument for God against God's existence, you might want to say, okay, then so what would need to change for it not to be an argument against God's existence? And I suppose one of those responses would be, well, it's gratuitous suffering. Like that's one we've dealt with. One might be, it seems like a great deal of suffering, like an unnecessary amount of pain. But it seems to me that if we had no examples of these supposed unnecessary amounts and degrees of pain, then we would just point to what was the highest degree of pain in that universe and say, well, that is still too much. Does that make sense? So if we didn't have forest fires or animals starving to death, we would have something. Maybe yes. I don't know. And that would then be the sort of litmus test of too much pain, which you'd point to. So I'd be like, so how much suffering can an animal endure that you would then look at it and say that's not enough to prove atheism?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Matt. And because one thing I was going to say was there is a little bit of relativity here. I mean, imagine that we really did just feel pleasure all the time, and instead of hurting, we would just cease to feel pleasure. I feel like we would still be reading dialogues concerning natural religion, and Philo would just be saying, how come we don't feel a lot of pleasure, and then when we get hurt, we just feel a little pleasure?
That's right. Yes.
Now, I think a lot of this boils down. But as far as animal suffering goes, and one thing I forgot to mention was that I also studied chronic pain. Pain that lasts longer than 6 months, that a lot of times shouldn't be there. I studied anxiety, fear. There's survival advantages to all of these that researchers have found. So it's so interesting to me that it kind of, for me, it confirmed Aquinas's privation view of evil. We don't like pain as free will beings, but it is a metaphysically good thing that is meant to help you survive in this world. What I think it all kind of boils down to is, why are we in a world where it is possible for something to hurt you or for you to die? That's what I think it really ultimately boils down to. And that's what we can get to in the last 2 points.
Yeah. Okay. So you said there were 4 points. How many have we
Oh
addressed so
yeah,
far?
I'm sorry. We've gotten past the first one, but the second one doesn't
Yeah.
take that long to
Yeah. Yeah.
discuss. There's just a lot of metaphysics involved, and you got to know Aquinas a lot. But I mean, okay, so the conclusion of Aquinas is 5 ways, right? God is pure act, pure existence itself. He isn't a an essence conjoined with existence. He just is existence, right? So he's infinite. He's infinitely perfect. One thing that Aquinas talks about is that we can't, in this life, and because we have finite intellects, because God is infinite, we even if we were able to see God somehow, and in this life we can't, right? We just know God. We know what God is like from his effects. We reason from
Hmm.
effect to cause. But even if we were able to see God somehow, we still might not even be able to comprehend his infinite goodness. And Aquinas was a virtue theorist, right? So he thinks what it is for a human being to be good is to have all these habits, these virtues, and these virtues are meant to guide you to your telos, to your final cause that God has for you, right? That so you're going to flourish as a human being. You're going to
Hmm.
know and love God as you're meant to. Um, but the problem is when we start thinking about, because the problem of evil says God ought not to allow animal suffering. Problem of animal suffering. God God wouldn't be all good if he allowed animal suffering. Well, um, within the confines of Aquinas's virtue ethics and his metaphysics and his arguments for God's existence, the thing is when you start thinking about is God a, a virtue, like what do we think God couldn't do? And
Hmm.
when we apply virtue ethics to God, it gets a little problematic. I know in one place Aquinas discusses how God can be said to have some virtues, but not others, right? So I think Aquinas would say that, or he did say that we can't say that God can have the virtues of sobriety, chastity, fortitude. He can't be courageous. And why is that? It's because he doesn't have a body, so he can't drink, he can't have sex. We can't say that he's courageous because there's nothing. He can't be in danger, right?
Right.
Now, he would say that certain virtues can be said of God. So God can be liberal. God can be generous. He says God can be just. And when he talks about God being just, though, he means distributive justice versus commutative justice. Like commutative justice is justice between equals, but since God is the creator, sustainer of all of his creatures, we're not equals. So God can only be said to be distributively just. But what distributive justice is when you determine what something under your authority should have, and then you make sure that it has it. Um, but God can be said to be virtuous as far as being liberal or being generous, because when God creates and sustains the world out of nothing, the difference between nothing and something is almost an infinite difference, right? So,
Hmm.
so God is generous, but what it boils down to is that since God is infinite goodness, God is infinitely perfect, and He's the source of human virtues. We could know that. Well, what it boils down to is that we can't, unless we were able to know His infinite essence. Well, if we were able to know what it means to be an infinitely perfect being, then we could know what He ought to do. But since we can't know him perfectly, we can't know what he ought to do in any given situation. We can know because he is the source of the virtues and because he's infinitely good, infinitely perfect, that everything he does will be virtuous. But I
Hmm.
can't say that he ought not to allow a fawn suffer for 3 or 4 days. Does that make sense?
Yes,
And
it does.
also,
Yeah.
I can't say that I know that there's no other way to create a fawn with the ability to feel pain. Um, and that would be a better way that would serve it better throughout its life and throughout the lifetime of all its uh, descendants. So you reach a point where it's at least, and I hope you see what I'm saying. I know that saying that pain and suffering are good and we can't know what God ought to do maybe won't be the most compelling, but I'm at least trying to show that there's no necessarily
Right.
logical contradiction here.
Again, I think it's important when we talk about the problem of evil to recognize that the atheist is the one who has the burden of proof here. He's the one trying to show that God's existence and evil, or unnecessary suffering, as he might say, are logically at odds with each other. So, as you said earlier, this is just a defensive response. You're just trying to show why that argument doesn't work. So it's not meant to be compelling. It's not meant to be like, oh, wow, now I see, therefore God exists. That's not what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
You're just trying to show that the argument doesn't work, right?
Yeah, and defenses are notorious for being not very compelling because it's just at bare minimum, I'm just trying to show there's no logical contradiction.
Sure, sure.
But my third and fourth points also will actually build on that too. They can help with the logical, they can help with the evidential. But I wanted to move more into. So I wasn't 100% sure, but let's say that Alex was. I know one thing Alex said was that the world we see is exactly what we'd expect if there was no God behind it. If it was just all random, if it's just the laws of nature and nothing else, this is the world we'd expect to see. So that's what I wanted to switch to more evidential in light of these next 2 points. And the 2 points were going to be that animals aren't persons, and that this world actually is a world we would expect to see, or at least explainable more from theism than naturalism. Okay, so the first point that I wanted to make was that, and this goes along with Aquinas' philosophy again. Aquinas followed Aristotle, argues that there's 3 types of souls in the world. In our physical world, you've got the souls of vegetative, sensitive, and rational souls, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty much like plants, animals, and human beings. Vegetative souls help, like the soul for him, and if there's any listeners that usually think of a soul just being what only humans have, the soul for Aristotle and Aquinas, it's the principle that distinguishes life from non-life. They weren't reductive. They didn't think that animals and plants are just reducible down to their parts. As a whole, a plant, as a substance, a plant or an animal that has a form, which is the soul. It's just the principle that keeps it alive. It's I'm just hoping your listeners know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's okay. But, I'm sure they will.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to do is go. Oh, well, I'm sorry. Yeah, one thing that the difference between a rational soul, right, and an animal soul is that a human being has the ability, has a immaterial intellect and a will, right? And what Aquinas and Aristotle think that a rational soul, it endows us with the ability to perform the 3 acts of the mind, which are apprehension, judgment, and reasoning. Okay. Mm-hmm. And in a few places in Aquinas' writings, he thinks that the soul is some of the operations of the intellect are what bring about our self-awareness, our self-consciousness, as some people say it. Whenever I think of myself as an individual. But what Aquinas says is that a part of the explanation for why we're self-aware is that in the act of knowing. So whenever I study something or just make any judgments in the act of knowing. So, I mean, you could talk about my red mug. So when I look at my red mug, and I know what it is, I do in the 3 acts of the mind, say I apprehend what it is. In this act of apprehending, judgment, reasoning, the mind not only makes judgments that the thing known exists, but it also makes a judgment that the thing knowing exists as well. And throughout time, as the mind realizes that things in the world not only exist, but it also exists, it forms a diachronic sense of a unity of diachronic self-awareness, basically, a sense of yourself over time. And that's what kind of builds your idea of yourself as an individual. Mm-hmm. And what I wanted to do is go out and look in the scientific literature and see if I could find evidence that supports his view. Because what his view is that animals don't perform the 3 acts of the mind. They don't have a rational soul, and they're not persons, so their suffering is not morally significant. And I can talk a little bit more about that here in a second. But this was one of the most interesting parts of my research, and something I never imagined I would be doing in seminary. But I went and I looked at the scientific literature. There's a branch of philosophy called the philosophy of animal minds, where they talk about all this. In science, there's a branch of study called comparative psychology, and this is where they study the difference between animals and humans. And this is one area where there's so much literature on it, and I get real detailed in the book. But there's three main things I thought were the most promising that entailed the type of rationality I was looking for: the Aristotelian three acts of the mind, and self-awareness. But when researchers are studying animals and trying to see if they're close to humans, they look for rationality, they look for something called episodic memory, and they look for metacognition. Okay. And as far as rationality goes, when you look at the literature, there's all sorts of different definitions for rationality. So you have to be clear if you're talking about when you say animals aren't rational, because some people just think rationality means that you can solve a problem. You want to be clear that you're talking about higher, way higher, like abstract thought, the ability to understand forms, universals, and that nature. Well, so like, for example, there does seem to be evidence that animals are close to human rationality. But in each case, what you'll find is that we think that their behavior is explainable by lower order systems. And I can show you what I mean just by talking about a few examples. When they're studying rationality in animals, I saw one article where they were doing research on dogs, and they were trying to see if dogs were rational. There's one experiment where they had some dogs, and they trained them to expect a reward if they did perform the correct action. But what they were supposed to do is find a ball, and they would have a 2 or 3 cups. And at the beginning of the experiment, they would lift the cups to show the dogs, in the beginning, they're just trained to know that if they get the ball, they're going to get a reward. Well, towards, into the study, they would get to the point where they would just lift one of the cups or 2 of the cups to show that the ball's not underneath those. And more than chance, more above whatever the percentage was, let's say 50%, the dogs performed well, and they would show them that there was no ball under some of the cups, and they would go to the leftover cup and they would find the ball and they'd get a reward. So they thought that this was evidence that dogs are able to perform exclusionary inferences, something like along the lines of, like the ball is either in under cup A or cup B. The ball is not under cup B, therefore it's under cup A, right? Now, in comparative psychology, though, there's a principle, maybe not everybody follows it, and it is something that has been debated, at least in the philosophy of animal minds. But there's a principle called Morgan's canon, okay? And when comparative psychology gets started in the early days after Darwin, some researchers were just going overboard with anthropomorphic ideas on what animals were capable of. And it was a psychologist. What was his name? Lloyd Morgan. Okay. He argued that if we can come up with a more simpler explanation for animal behavior, we always ought to err on that side rather than say that animals are more like human beings. Because when we look at the animal kingdom, there's obviously huge differences between humans and animals. So the Morgan's canon says that if you can ever explain a behavior with a more simpler, lower order system than attributing human, because as human beings, like we're very prone to anthropomorphizing.
Okay, could you tell us what do you mean by rationality then? When we say we're looking for rationality, what is it we're looking for then? And then let's move on to episodic.
Okay, yeah. Well, if they're going to be like human beings, then they're going to do the exclusionary inference I just talked about, higher order reasoning. Researchers that are skeptical that this experiment showed that they're capable of higher order reasoning, the abstract thought, argued that their behavior is more likely explainable through associative learning. Okay, so it's instead of the dog going through some syllogism or an exclusionary inference, they think that over the course of the experiment, the dog most likely just learned to associate. It's associative learning. So like in the beginning it learns that getting a ball is going to give it some food, it's going to give it a reward, so it associates the ball with a
Or with the
reward.
food. Yes.
When it sees the ball, it brings up the idea of reward, so it seeks the ball. Well, it's a lot more complicated than that. I don't ever want to downplay what animals are capable of, because they're capable of some amazing things.
Yeah.
But what they're saying is, throughout the experiment, the dog, instead of higher order reasoning, would just associate, if there's two cups and you lift one and it doesn't have the ball, it just associates that with the ball being in the other place.
Makes sense. So it's like, I like that.
Yeah.
So it's yeah. So like sort of like Occam's razor, you're kind of referring to, like the simplest explanation. Let's kind of go with that. Okay, what's episodic memories?
Episodic memories.
And let's get through these quick, because we only have about 14 minutes left.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so episodic memory is I think it's fascinating. It's memory. It's a personal memory that you have, a memory of you doing something as an individual. Okay, so and that's distinguished with semantic memory, which is just a fact about the world.
Yeah.
Okay. They did research here with scrub jays. They would allow the scrub jays to go bury some of their food. Their preferred food was worms, or let's just say worms. Is worms and crickets. A food that they would eat, but they didn't like as much, was peanuts. They would allow them to go bury or cache their food, and then come back to a holding area. And then sometimes they wouldn't hold them that long. Sometimes they would hold them for a really long time. They found that when they wouldn't hold them for that long, the scrub jays would go right back to the preferred food. But if they held them for a really long time, they wouldn't even go to where the worms and crickets were, because those are perishable. After a while, they're just not any good. And if they held them for a long time, they'd go back to the peanuts. They'd just go straight to the peanuts. And they thought this was evidence that they had episodic memory, because they were able to remember the who, what, when, where, and why. I mean, I've said too many of those. I shouldn't have said why and who, but you know what I'm saying? Like they thought that they had personal memories of where they put it. But using Morgan's canon, other researchers didn't think this was necessarily evidence of episodic memory. They thought maybe they have real-time semantic memory of where the stored food is. Do you know what I'm saying? So like,
yes,
it's just a fact. Like they didn't necessarily remember themselves burying it. They just maybe have real-time knowledge of, well, it's been a day and the food is bad. Another one was maybe they just associated longer wait times with spoiled food. So they eventually learned that they shouldn't go to where the worms were. Mm-hmm. A really fascinating case had to do with a human being. In 1981, there was a person named Casey. That's all they say in the literature. But he got into a motorcycle accident, and he lost all of his episodic memory. So like he could tell you the address of his childhood home, but he couldn't tell you a single event that happened in that house.
Wow.
They also found that because he didn't have some episodic memory, he also couldn't picture himself in the future. If you asked him what he's going to do tomorrow, he'd say it was just a blank. He had no idea. He couldn't picture himself in the future or the past. He had no episodic memory. He couldn't picture, so it was really fascinating what they think the difference between semantic and episodic memory is. And we don't think that there's nothing that necessitates that we think that animals have to have episodic memory. The third one is metacognition. And this is the ability to think about your own thoughts.
Right.
We think that, that's definitely goes along the lines of what I was talking about, what Aquinas thinks brings about self-awareness. I mean, we don't have to talk about that too much.
I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So, animals, your point is, don't have these three things.
Yes. So there's three main points I want to make. First of all, if they don't have the three acts of the mind, they don't know that they are suffering. Does that make sense? If they don't have metacognition, they can't think about their. So like
they're suffering, but don't know that they're suffering.
Yes. A third point. Let's see. I'm forgetting the second point. Let me just talk about the other one, and I'm sure it'll come to me. The third point is that they don't have free will. And you and I have talked about that before. Aquinas argues that pain in humans is a punishment, that God allows them to experience pain as a punishment for original sin. But the thing is, if animals don't have free will, they don't will to not be in pain. Mm-hmm. They experience pain. They're not self-aware. So the point is that there is no person in the animal kingdom saying, I am in pain right now and I wish I wasn't. If
So
they don't have episodic.
they do flee suffering by instinct, you would
Yes.
say.
Yes. And they experience pain, but it's yeah, that's the point I was trying to remember. Episodic memory. They don't remember themselves personally in pain. They can't imagine themselves in the future as being in pain personally. When they
Wow.
feel pain or when they see a danger, they associate it with, if they see something dangerous, they associate it with pain and they try to avoid it. If they feel pain, it moves them to get out of it. But at no point is there a person who's in pain. So my point is that it's not something that, and this can help with the logical and evidential problem, is that there are no persons in the animal kingdom experiencing pain. uh, uh, Alex in his video said that he thought that, he was talking about a view called neo-Cartesianism, which William Lane Craig defended. But that's the view that they don't feel anything. The Thomistic view is that they are feeling it, just not as persons. And I found a distinction in the comparative psychology literature. I think it really helps with this. It's the distinction between awareness and consciousness. And we say that animals are conscious of the world. They're just not aware of the world, and they're not aware of their consciousness of the world.
Yeah.
An easy way to think about it, I think, is that, like I'm sure people like you and I, Matt, and a lot of your viewers, we're always thinking about things, thinking about God and all this. Well, have you ever driven to work and when you get there, you realize that you actually have no idea what you've been doing for the past 20 minutes?
Yeah, you're like, I remember being at a job in my hometown of South Australia, and a friend came to me having arrived at our place of work, and she said, I don't think I looked at the road once. Like, she had no memory.
Yeah, and my wife has told me that I'm not allowed to think and drive. Not that I've gotten us almost killed, but I take wrong turns all the time because I'm thinking about something else.
That's cool. Yeah.
In instances like that, you're aware of your awareness is being cast upon your own thoughts. You're thinking about Aquinas. You're thinking about God or animal suffering. You're conscious of the road the entire time. And it's so crazy to think about because your arms are moving, your leg is, your foot's on the pedal and on the brake. You're reacting to things in the environment, but your awareness is somewhere else. But when you get there, it's almost like it never happened to you.
Well, got you.
The thing is that when we think about animal pain, I think it's probably impossible to think about what it is like to be an animal, because when you're thinking about that, you're casting your awareness onto it. And you're intrinsically thinking about it as a self-aware being. They're conscious of the world. The consciousness is passive, awareness is active. That's the big distinction. Animals are conscious of the world, they're just not aware of it. So they're feeling pain, they're reacting to it, they're seeing dangers, they're reacting to it, but it's all on the level of particulars, it's all on the level of associative learning.
Wow, this is really fascinating. I guess I have two questions for you then. One's a little strange. If it were to be shown, now this is just a nice philosophical thought experiment here, right? If it were to be shown that animals were persons, or at least some animals were persons, or let's just say we get rid of all that research and we live in a world where animals are persons and yet they suffer, would that constitute a good argument against God's existence? In other words, I'm just trying to think, like, what would you say to that? Animals are self-aware. They experience pain. It's not really soul-making. God's not making it up for them in the afterlife, if Aquinas is right, and animals don't go to heaven, nor is it necessarily a result of free will. Is this a problem for Christianity?
Well, this was an interesting, I'm so glad you asked that. This is an interesting area of the problem that I didn't foresee when I started my research. If we find that animals are self-aware, they are capable of the three acts of the mind. The issue is that this ceases to become the problem of animal suffering, because now we're talking about rational animals. And now all the rational theodicies apply to them.
Oh, wow. Very,
do you know what I'm saying?
Very interesting. Yes, so if animals were persons, then Aquinas would say, then, of course, since they're rational, they will be saved.
If they have a rational, if they have a rational soul, that means that their soul can survive the death of their bodies. Now we are talking about the possibility of soul-making, free will. I would probably, because they don't see, they don't have language, I would probably place them in the category of like the same issue when we're dealing with what happens to babies or infants that die before they
Hmm.
become mature. I really think that's where we would situate them, and it
I
would no
see.
longer be the problem of animal suffering.
That's an
We would just
excellent.
assume they're all going to be in heaven
That's an
at the
excellent
new heaven
response.
story.
Now,
Yeah,
I don't want to quote Alex or speak for him, but it seemed like in the video he was responding to Dr. Craig, who made a similar point that to what you just did, that namely animals are suffering, but they're not aware that they are suffering.
yeah.
I think he said, okay, then just like beat your dog. Then, like, is there not a problem with that? Is it not a problem with torturing a dog
Oh
or a
yeah.
cat or a fish?
I mean, I think that would, and Aquinas has a pretty famous example for this. He says that it's not for the sake of the animal, it's for the sake of the human to not do things like that. Because we are doing virtue ethics and we want to build good habits, if you mistreat helpless animals just for the fun of it, that's going to be bad for you as an individual. And it's going to be a bad habit that's probably going to carry over into the rest of your life. But one
Interesting.
thing he didn't get too much into, but I think Aquinas would agree on, is that God created and sustained, and one thing I'm about to talk about in the fourth step is talking about a hierarchy of being that God creates. And animals are a big part of that. They're
Okay.
created for our good and they're here for us. So I think with Christianity, we should at least, I mean, you could get really philosophical with it, but at least have a common sense. Um, uh, what is it called when you take care of something someone's given you? Um,
Courtesy, sort of
yeah, like when we take care of the world and we take care of the environment
stewardship.
because it is, yes, a common sense stewardship. Like if I gave one of my sons when they get older, I give them a car and they just destroy it because the car
Ah.
can't feel anything. I'm gonna get pretty upset, right? Or I
Hmm.
mean, if I gave them an animal, it's like, yeah, I don't think it's self-aware and that it's experiencing the pain, but I didn't give them the animal so they could have fun torturing it. I gave them the animals so they could enjoy it and have a fun childhood. And it's the same way with animals. Like God didn't put animals here for us to enjoy. And it would be like a natural law type response. Pain
Mm.
obviously is made for them to avoid whatever is causing them the pain. So
Mm.
it's common sense for me not to cause them pain because they're designed to avoid things that cause that.
Gotcha.
So I
Okay.
can just know that God doesn't want me to cause animals pain. Um,
Unnecessarily.
so
Yeah.
yeah, so we need to be careful, and there's actually a handful of researchers who have tried to hash out animal ethics with Thomism, and they've done a good job. But at the like, I just definitely wouldn't say that it follows that because an animal doesn't suffer personally, and that it's okay for God to, because there's definitely a big distinction between what we think it's okay for God to do and what it's okay for
Right. Right.
humans to
Right.
do.
Of
So
course.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, we could definitely delve into that. We don't have time right now. I could
right.
see people coming back and saying, well, you have an incredibly low view of animals, right? Like this idea that you choose not to mistreat them for your sake and not the animal's sake. And but I think you've responded to that sufficiently, at least in this short interview. Could we
Okay.
conclude with the fourth point?
Yes, yes, and that's all we have left is it's and there's a professional philosopher named Paul Draper who's made
Mm.
arguments like this. What they'll say is what Draper does in his articles. He says it's so interesting to me, and I think this works great if you're talking to a more scientifically minded atheist. So
Hmm.
because they look at the issue more scientifically, more evidentially, and they say, okay, well, what Draper says is, well, let's assume that evolutionary theory is true, and let's attach it to theism or what he calls Christian theism. So it's specifically Christianity. Let's attach it to Christianity and predict what kind of world you'll see with that. Then let's also attach it to naturalism and predict the world that we would see with that. Draper argues that so he makes the observation that there's so many animals that in this life they not only experience pain but they also flounder. They don't reach maturity. They die before they reach maturity, or the problem of animal suffering, right? They're
Hmm.
dying, they're getting cancer, they're starving, all sorts of stuff like that. he says that this world, that's surprising given Christian theism, because he assumes that you wouldn't see that if Christian theism were true. And then he says, now let's look at naturalism and evolutionary theory. And he says, yeah, this is a better explanation for what we see, given that so many animals flounder and suffer and die. Now, this was another fun part of my research. I went to Aquinas's thought in the Summa Contra Gentiles. He argues in several places why he thinks the world is the way it is, and I've already mentioned it a little bit. Aquinas follows Pseudo Dionysius, and he says that what their issue back in medieval philosophy was, why would God create anything at all? And it's an interesting problem, because if you think about it, God is infinitely perfect. So God doesn't want for anything, right? He just eternally exists as this perfect being. When we do things, it's to, I eat so I can live, or I go learn something so I can gain knowledge. Anything I do is for some good for me that I don't have, or to keep a good that I do have. But God is infinitely perfect. So why would he even want to create anything? He doesn't want for anything. And what Aquinas and those guys thought was, the one thing they could think of was that God likely wants to create because God is love. Because God is infinitely loving, when we look in the world, we see people that possess love. It's never something you just want to keep to yourself, right? The more love you have, it's not like a diamond that you want to bury away somewhere so no one can touch it or even see it but you. When you have love, you just want to spread it. And so because God is infinitely loving, they thought that if he's going to make a world, it's because he's inclined to make one, because he thought because he would want to share his love. He would want to, what Aquinas calls, communicate his goodness. So God, because he's all loving, he wants to make a universe with rational beings in it who can know him and love him in return. So he can spread his love in reality. So in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas makes like 7 different types of arguments for what he thinks this is going to entail. But a big portion of this is that because God wants to communicate his love to rational beings, he needs to create a hierarchy of being that points metaphysically upwards to him. So the hierarchy is going to have like inanimate objects at the bottom, and then you've got your vegetative, sensitive, rational souls, and it's degrees of perfection, all pointing metaphysically upwards to God. And that's a part of why God makes all this world with all these things in it. It's showing off his power. It's showing off his knowledge. Another thing is that any world that God creates is going to have intelligent beings in it. So what all this, I'm sorry, one last thing is that Aquinas didn't think that there was any best world that God could create. He argued that any world, since God is infinite goodness itself, if God is going to make a world that's going to communicate that, it's actually impossible. Like God can't make something infinitely good to show someone that, hey, this is what I'm like, because he's using, imperfect, what am I trying to get at? He's using contingent reality to point to his perfection. So any world he could create is going to be finite, right? Because you can't have an actual infinite in reality. I mean, we could debate that. But any world that he makes is going to fall infinitely short of his goodness. But any world he makes, he could have just made a world with one more good thing in it. So Aquinas argues that he just has to settle on a world that's ontologically good enough that is going to show his goodness, and then he needs to order it perfectly with physical laws and a moral law. He needs physical laws to guide the universe to its purpose, all the inanimate and other objects. But he also needs a moral law to guide free-willed beings to their purpose, because he can't control them with the physical law. He has to at least install a moral law to guide them to their purpose. Well, anyways, like I said, the big takeaway from all this is that any world God creates is going to be a world with rational beings in it. It's going to be a finite world. It's going to be governed by natural laws and a moral law. So now, animal suffering might look like it's a bad thing, But it actually, when we reason to why we think God would create anything, we see that any world He creates is going to have rational beings in it. When you start thinking about naturalism, what Draper calls the no design hypothesis, the existence of rational higher beings like human beings is a cosmic miracle, right? If you've ever studied the design argument, like the fine tuning argument, they say that if you just have a one-off scenario and a universe is just going to be a random configuration, the odds of it being a universe ordered so that you can have higher life forms like us are practically zero. Like it's impossible. So I would argue that theism actually predicts a universe more like ours than naturalism would. And one of the biggest points I'd like to point out is that naturalism actually doesn't predict any world. If it's all random, any world we see is exactly the world we'd expect to see according to naturalism, because it doesn't predict a world. The laws of nature are surprising. Life is surprising. Sentient, self-aware life is surprising. And also, naturalism doesn't have the metaphysical foundation for even arguing that animals are floundering. If animals formed for no reason, then they don't have you can't really talk about maturity, right? You can't talk about how they ought to be, because there is no way they ought to be. They're just here for no reason randomly. So you can't even talk about animal suffering as a bad thing. It just is. Like if you go with naturalism, the evidential problem, you can't really make the evidential problem. Does that make sense? Because you can't say this is the way how the world ought not to be. Because you can't say that, because it's just completely random.
I want to respond to that and then ask one final question before we wrap up, Kyle. But before we do, I need to just say thank you to one of our sponsors. On this particular link. Again, that's hallow.com/Matt Fradd. It is hallow.com/Matt Fradd. You get a month for free, and so you can try everything out on the app. And if you like it, then you can choose to pay the nominal amount they ask for. It's really excellent. My wife and I have used it. We both really like it. Hallow HALLOW.com/Matt Fradd. Hallow.com/Matt Fradd. Okay, so I think the response would be something like, I'm not saying on naturalism things ought to be a certain way. I think this is the atheist response, and maybe I'm not fully understanding, so feel free to rebuke me here. I think people like Alex would say, no, sure, like on naturalism, things just are the way they are, and we can like it or not like it. But what I'm saying, the atheist, is that this fairy tale that you've come up with of a sort of God that created the universe and is all loving, all knowing, under that kind of hypothesis, right, then it makes no sense to say that animals should suffer needlessly and to the degree in which they suffer. So I don't think the atheist is saying, given naturalism, things shouldn't be this way. I think they're saying, if you're right and the Christian God exists, then we can now say things shouldn't be this way, and that's how the argument gets off and running. Am I misunderstanding you?
I don't want to say you are. Kind of yes and no. Because I do want to emphasize when they say this is the world, this is exactly the way we would expect if there is no God. And I would push back.
Oh,
on that.
got you. There you go. That's a good answer to me. Yes. Because they are still saying, if there is no God, we should expect this. And you're saying, why expect any kind of world? Because whatever world shows up is a world we could have expected given naturalism. Is that?
Yes,
Yes.
exactly.
Yeah, sorry, I
Yeah.
misunderstood that. That's excellent. It's a good response.
Oh yeah, and just the other thing is just that you know at the end of the day, do I know what an all powerful, all wise, all good, all knowing God would do? Not really. But when I look at this world and I see that animals are endowed with the ability to survive because they have the ability to feel pain, and it's a little mind bending, but when we look at it, we don't think they are self aware. So that's a mercy too, is it not?
Mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm.
it's also a part of what we think that theism can, in a sense, predict that any world that God is going to make is going to be like. So, on one hand, you've got naturalism saying, well, it's all random. So, I would point out that that doesn't predict anything. But then you've got theism that says that God is going to want to create a world that communicates his goodness.
Mm.
Does it have things in it that we don't like? Maybe, but that's not the problem of animal suffering. That's the problem of evil, because now you're
Mm.
talking about how you relate to the world. When
That's
we're
very
talking about
good, yeah.
animals, we're talking about beings that aren't aware they're suffering. They're endowed with the ability to feel pain, so it helps them survive. And they are in a world that is predicted by theism, that has rational beings in it and is
That's a
ordered,
yeah,
and
that's a
there's
really
morality.
good summary of it right there. Yeah. I think
Mm.
too, suppose the logical argument, against God's existence from evil can be shown to not work, which I think it has. I think that's pretty much generally understood. Just the idea that God may have sufficient reason for permitting evil and suffering, etc., right? And suppose you're left only with the evidential problem. Like, well, given the amount of evil, it seems less likely that a loving God exists, right? Just to kind of point out to our viewers that if you have a good argument or a series of good arguments, or even just sort of intuitions to think that God exists, and you're confronted with this evidentiary problem of evil, I think you can say, okay, well, I don't know how to respond to that. Like, this might be your response, and I think it's a decent one. I don't know how to respond to that, and I do find it troubling. However, I have reasons to think that God exists, and so therefore, even though I'm
Yes.
not sure how to respond to it, there is a response to it that it would be satisfactory, even if I don't know it.
Yes. I like that, Matt.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things we're pointing at is the evidential, like, yeah, and also don't forget what the evidential problem is, that we can't say that pain is evil. We're just
Yeah.
getting to maybe these extreme cases, like, because like I said, even when the fawn is burning or is suffering for 4 days, its pain still serves a purpose, even though ultimately it doesn't help it.
Yeah.
But the problem is whittled down a lot when you realize that pain is not evil. It's
Yeah.
the thing causing the evil that maybe we should need to deal with. But like I said, when you get to thinking about, any world God is going to create is going to be finite. It's going to be governed by physical laws, at least. So, but yeah, I would emphasize that yes, pain and suffering are good for the animals. Um, but
Yeah.
yes, just like you said, like, we have really good reasons, and this is a great, bringing up is great for when you're doing evangelism. You can always use those kind of pivot points to pivot into your argument for God's existence, or just
Mm.
talking about all these reasons why you think that Christianity is true, and start getting ready to talk
Yeah.
about Jesus and the gospel.
Just go
So
back to that fawn example for a moment. I just thought of something else. You would say, okay, so you got a fawn. It's under a tree branch. It can't get out. It's precisely the pain and suffering that the fawn is experiencing that's leading it to try to get out. And suppose it were
yeah,
successful, I think the atheist would say, well, that's a good thing. Well, okay. So it's only bad if it led to death. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, that doesn't seem to be terribly compelling to me. If we're willing to
yes,
say that the pain and suffering the fawn
yeah,
experiences that could lead it to safety is a good thing, then it's only bad when it doesn't. Yeah.
right,
I still haven't fully
yeah.
thought it through, but
I mean,
yeah.
and again, if it's a mature fawn, it wouldn't have even made it that far. That's kind of one of the points I try to get at, is that when we get to the suffering and we say, well, how come it's not, it's bad because it's not serving a higher purpose now, but it already did, like, not that pain, but its ability to feel pain already served a higher purpose, which is just to help sustain it and to keep the whole species going throughout all this time. So I almost think that when we focus on its pain now, we just forget about all the good that the ability to
Yeah,
feel pain caused in the past. So it's
I
almost
like
like we're
that.
saying, well, it's pointless, but, well, it's still alive, isn't it? Up to the forest fire. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is really helpful. Thank you so much for coming on the show and helping us think through that. You've
yeah,
given us
thank
really
you
good
for having me.
examples, and I know it's difficult because you've thought about this for so long and you've written so much on it. I wish we had like a 3 or a 5 hour show so that we could kind of delve into every topic, and maybe we'll have you back.
Oh yeah, and I tell
But
people all the time, if you know someone who just got their PhD, don't ask them about it because they'll talk about it for hours. So it was hard for me to try to distill everything down to an hour. I hope we didn't go over too long.
no, 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 that was excellent. How can people learn more about you? Is there another sort of podcast you've done somewhere where you've kind of gone into some of these things in greater detail? You'd have them look at. Tell us how to get your book.
Oh yes, I did do a podcast on it. I talked about it for a couple of hours on the oh man, I'm forgetting what it's
Classical
called.
theism, right? John DeRosso. Was that
Yes.
his or a different one?
Oh yes, classical theism with John DeRossa.
Yeah,
We
that's an excellent
he
podcast.
let me go and we talked for like an hour and 45 minutes. But yes, also I go in a lot more detail in my book, uh, Thomism and the Problem of Animal Suffering. You can find it on Amazon, Christian Book, Barnes and Noble. So if you just Google, you know, Keltz and
Yeah.
Thomism, Problem of Animal Suffering, you should be able to find it. A lot of my academic articles are on my personal website. It's bkylekeltz.com. You can actually read a lot of my articles for free on there, and that'll kind of delve into some of the stuff if you want to get in a lot more detail. But my book is pretty much my dissertation, so that's the culmination of all my research. So I recommend people check that out. And yes, John DeRosa was great. We talked on the Classical Theism podcast, so I would also recommend that. And that's what people can check out.
Sweet.
And you can contact me at my personal website as well if you have any questions. So
Great. Well, I'll put the links to your book, to your website, and to your interview with John DeRossa below. Well, thank you
okay,
so
great.
much.
All right, thank you.